Sickness ravaging a community with debate around inoculation and a tense political climate that pits neighbor against neighbor. No, I'm not talking about 2025 or 2020. I am talking about 1776. And with her newest middle grade, Rebellion 1776, Laurie Halse Anderson throws us into a historical moment primed to help us unpack our current reality. And was it fair for me, a fully grown adult, to go into this middle grade novel expecting it to help me unpack the current reality? Maybe not. But I did expect a bit of a balm because middle grade has the unique ability to help make sense of the world for those who are coming into it for the first time. And this novel is for all of us who wake up every morning and realize that we still have to go to work and go about our daily lives amidst all of this history, and a reminder that we have always had to go about our daily lives amidst all of this history, and helping to make sense of this history and making the history feel a little closer and a little more immediate, especially for middle grade readers. And as an OG reader of Fever 1793, this places us amidst another historical epidemic and places us amidst the Revolutionary War and the birth of our nation for this July 4th Feature Friday. But before we jump all the way in, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book-adjacent things on this channel, including, ideally, every Friday, diving deeper into a specific work. So if that sounds up your alley, like, subscribe, hang out a little longer, because as just introduced, today we are talking about Rebellion 1776 by Laurie Halse Anderson. I find it particularly interesting in terms of the historical context that this book is titled Rebellion versus Revolution. And I think that there's a lot to explore with this book, both within the craft and story of this book in particular, and with this book in conversation with the current cultural climate, especially as someone who came up as a middle grade reader, especially fascinated and really drawn to historical fiction, and went through a huge Revolutionary War era of that reading journey, but not necessarily really contextualizing my current reality within the framework of that, especially as someone who was coming up as a younger reader pre and post 9/11, and the way that that frames the conversation. And so trying as an adult reader to kind of juggle the duality of knowing or trying to recollect what I would have been looking for in a historical fiction as a middle grade reader, while also appreciating as an adult or seeking some kind of parallels or draw to the current moment and commentary on the current moment within that same fiction. And especially, like I said, fiction that is helping young readers who are really discovering the world for the first time and what that means. And also, unfortunately, really considering the current precarious moment for young people's literature in relation to the rampant book challenging and book bans that are happening nationally. And again, it is a loud and frankly weird and vitriolic minority that lack basic reading comprehension in most cases that are forwarding these book bans. However, they are unfortunately wreaking havoc in many communities and will continue to wreak havoc if we do not stand in opposition and use our voice to contest it. And so I found myself in this really weird in-between of trying to balance all of these kind of disparate thoughts during Elspeth's journey in this book. And our protagonist and point of view character in this book is 13-year-old Elspeth, who is a maid in Boston, and her father are newer to Boston, having relocated from Philadelphia after losing their entire family to smallpox, with her father and Elspeth being the sole survivors. And while her father has found Elspeth a job as a maid with a loyalist judge, his income as someone who sews sails for ships is really impacted by the siege Boston is under at the start of the book. And so at the beginning of the book, we watch the tide really turn from the loyalists to the patriots in Boston, and the way that loyalists are kicked out of the city. And Elspeth and her father are not loyalists by any means, but we see the real danger of it, and her father wants them to leave the city as the loyalists are being forced out, but Elspeth does not want to leave the city, and so she hides, only to wake up the next morning and not know where her father is. And so she decides that the best course of action in order to help her father find her easier is to stay in the household she was already working at. While the judge that she previously worked for has been sent away and exiled, she finds employment with the family of a Patriot spy who is released in this change of power and starts working for him and his family, including their ward, Hannah. And the entire novel, except toward the end a little bit, takes place over the course of the year 1776 and all of the upheaval politically that happens over that year. However, a lot of that is in the background of Elspeth's very personal journey and also her day-to-day trials and tribulations as a maid in this household, and especially one that the housekeeper has taken a dislike to. And amidst all of this political upheaval, Boston is also facing an increase in smallpox. And because of this, during the summer, the city basically shuts down for inoculation, and many are coming into the city for the express purpose of inoculation. And Elspeth finds herself having to care for this household as they are getting over the lower grade case of smallpox, even as it forces her to face a lot of her own trauma around the disease and essentially losing her whole family to it. It really asks us questions about our own sense of self and survival, as well as our larger obligations to community amidst these big historical moments. And these moments that feel big in the moment, but also are balanced by the day-to-day drudgery. And as the book says, broken mirrors, broken towns, shattered nations. They could not ever be the same. However, they could be made anew, crafted into a different object or a different sort of place. And so there are a lot of big ideas at the heart of this book, but we are seeing it all through the point of view of 13-year-old Elspeth. And I think the first person narration makes perfect sense within the context of this novel, especially for its audience, because it brings a familiarity and an immediacy to the moment for middle grade readers where history can feel so distant. And I think there are a lot of choices made in the novel to familiarize readers or to make the settings feel familiar to readers, and to kind of drive home the fact that even though things are very, very different now in the sense that, like, we don't use chamber pots regularly, there are also a lot of things that are very much the same, especially if we're looking at things like wealth inequality. No, we probably aren't hiring a 13-year-old as a maid, and her entire future is not dependent on her place in that household, but at the same time, the novel really does make that danger clear. And in many ways, Hannah, who is the ward of the Pike family, is set up as a kind of foil to Elspeth, because while Hannah is in a much different circumstance, especially financial, in many ways her position is just as precarious as Elspeth's. And there is a whole speech from Mrs. Pike later in the book that basically kind of sets out the reality of life as a woman for these young women amidst the world. Another thing that I found particularly interesting, and as an adult made me very nervous when the idea was introduced in the book, was this idea that Elspeth looks older than she is. And there's a moment in the book where she is fighting with her father at the beginning where he basically calls her out for being naive and that she needs to be careful because she looks older than she is. And there are also these moments with Hannah where she's being kept under the Pike's roof until essentially she can marry, and her guardian has these moments where he looks at her kind of oddly, and there are these moments that might read kind of uncomfortable for a child, I would assume. And I'm also not going to question a younger reader's intelligence in these moments or their ability to pick up on some of this. However, as an adult, that makes me much more nervous, right? Because I know the dangers that Elspeth is facing as someone that may present older in a world without protection. And there are dangers, I think, that middle grade readers can recognize in that, but at the same time, there is a little aspiration in that. I remember being young and wanting to be older, wanting to be wiser, and to be able to move around the world more freely. But as we get older, we realize that as we move around the world more freely, there are certain dangers that come attached to that. And there are dangers that Elspeth faces. Luckily, not some of the worst that could be imagined when positioned that way, but it does bring this kind of immediacy to the moment and reminds us as readers of the danger that she really is in, even amidst the kind of day-to-day drudgery of her world, because there is a little bit of drudgery in this narrative. It is a 400-page historical fiction, and I kind of went back and forth with myself about the length of it and if the immediacy of the narrative was really evident throughout, especially knowing that a lot of librarians and teachers and people who are much more aware of the current state of young literacy and the middle grade market have really been clamoring for shorter middle grade and young adult novels. And I would consider this, for the age range, a longer novel. However, I don't know that it needed to be as long as it was. I feel like we were trying to get a full scope and space of this time period, which as a historical fiction reader I can appreciate, and especially as a young middle grade historical fiction reader, I feel like that's really what attracted me to the genre. I wanted to learn about these time periods. I wanted to imagine myself in the time periods, even if they weren't glamorous. And there's a certain kind of day-to-day drudgery that takes place here that really gives and establishes a sense of the place and also the kind of emotional landscape. And I think also kind of pulls out that long, hot, awful summer of the getting over smallpox. However, at the same time, I don't feel like this being set on the edge of rebellion, of revolution, that the Revolutionary War aspect of it feels very immediate to things, which is interesting because I can understand why it wouldn't. I think the most immediate it really feels is understanding the siege at the beginning and the way that these larger conversations are impacting these people's lives on the day-to-day without them really having a say in what is going on. But I find it particularly interesting in relation to naming the novel Rebellion. First, in contrast to naming it something like Revolution. And I think Rebellion is interesting, right? Because it places us in the very specific moment, but it doesn't anticipate the outcome or the success of that moment. And it also really kind of encompasses and pulls in all of the small little rebellions that take place over the course of the book, and how one person, one young girl like Elspeth, can be part of this larger rebellion in her day-to-day, whether she is actively participating or not, and also all of her own little rebellions, including not going with her father at the beginning of the book, and how that one choice changes the course of her life, and how all of these little choices are changing the course of these lives, as well as if we get into the smallpox of it all, because there is a large conversation around smallpox and inoculation, and there is a quarantine later in the book. And thinking about the young readers that will be encountering this book in the current moment and how their lives so far really have been shaped by quarantine and by COVID. And so they're seeing a lot of the modern conversations that as a young reader, as a young middle grade reader, I would have taken for granted conversations about inoculation in books like this, because I would have been coming at it from the modern, at the time, understanding of scientific progression and understanding things like vaccines as accepted measures of public health. I distinctly remember being in elementary school at the library and our librarian telling us about how much the polio vaccine changed everything and the relief that it brought, and also her just trying to make us understand a world in which iron lungs existed. And so I found this particularly interesting because as a middle grade reader, I think smallpox would have been the sickness essentially that I would have understood the most in something like this. And I think that things like Fever 1793 with the scarlet fever came out and were meant to kind of like show us other sicknesses. Or maybe I was just too macabre a child. But one thing that really struck me in this narrative was them talking about kind of sneaking out the smallpox victims at night, burying them at night, really trying to hide the full extent of the problem of smallpox at the time, and the ways in which not knowing the full extent makes it feel less. And yes, it's a way to prevent panic for populations that really already understood the dangers of smallpox, but I think that the parallel can then be drawn very starkly to the current moment, where a lot of the worst of 2020 can be hidden in denialism because people can say, oh, well, I didn't see it, so it didn't happen. And also I think with this, the way that smallpox presents itself and that it is so visually alarming. With this too, though, I do think that there was a kind of understanding of smallpox written in to the novel a little bit too much. I think that for readers who have never encountered smallpox, I think that it assumed the reader knew a little bit too much about the trajectory of the disease, as well as it didn't really want to get into the full horrors of it. And maybe it's because it wanted to focus on Elspeth's emotional horrors related to the disease, things that there are children, surely, that can relate to now, losing a parent to a disease, or maybe it's just that it feels too horrific because it feels more immediate, and maybe it can be described differently for me as a middle grade reader in the 2000s versus now. At the same time, a lot of these parallels were very subtle. I think probably the most on the nose was a conversation with Mrs. Pike where she originally didn't want her children to be inoculated, and her children convince her otherwise. And there are clearly some echoes of anti-vax sentiment there that I think are handled very compassionately, considering it is a very divisive contemporary discourse, and one that I potentially have a lot of feelings about. At the same time, I think I can give Mrs. Pike a lot more grace because it was a different moment and the scientific knowledge was different, but also she was willing to listen and change her opinion. And I think especially in middle grade, it's very important to leave these opportunities for opinions to change and behaviors to change. For instance, we see Elspeth kind of falling into these traps of lies throughout the course of the novel that she's telling for survival, essentially, or because she doesn't know how to navigate this world. And we have to remember that she is 13 years old navigating this world alone, and a world that is changing in really significant ways, especially as she is on the cusp of adulthood and staring down an uncertain adulthood with dreams that are referenced but not super defined. And at the same time, her life doesn't allow a lot of space for them to be defined because she doesn't really have a lot of that autonomy. And I think that for a lot of middle grade readers today that will ring true. Also, the idea of her looking older than she is, I think is important within the current moment, especially as we're looking at the kind of erasure of the real preteen era, and this idea that a lot of teenagers, especially as they gain access to social media, often prematurely, are presenting as older because that is what they are aspiring to, but without really knowing the full responsibility or breadth of that, and just kind of going through the motions. And so I think in some ways that Elspeth is a reflection there as well for contemporary teens. And like I said, her first person point of view gives the modern middle grade reader a little bit more of that immediacy as well. It makes her and her circumstances feel more familiar even amidst the historical context. Another way Anderson attempts to do this, and it's been so long since I've read Fever 1793, so I can't speak accurately to whether this was utilized in that novel as well, but when I was growing up as a historical fiction middle grade reader, a lot of the popular narratives were kind of formatted as journals, and not just the Dear America series, though of course the only thing that's coming to the top of my mind right now is Witch Child, but that kind of epistolary structure made the history feel closer, and it also invited us as readers in to that emotional journey and drew parallels with the emotional journeys of the past to the present. And this is told through a more straightforward first-person point of view. However, there are parenthetical asides that almost break the fourth wall with the reader. And I'm not gonna lie to you, even knowing why or anticipating, theorizing why they were utilized, I'm not sure they were always successful for me, especially because they really became evident. There was one earlier, but it didn't really become clear that's what was going on until around page 58, which I think is pretty late to establish a convention. And again, I think they were utilized to help modern young readers feel more connected. And I'd be really interested to hear what teachers or youth services librarians think about this in context of modern young readership as well, because as I have stated before, and will state especially with every middle grade conversation and or review, I have no actual expertise in this area. However, I do think it is very important to continue to read young people's literature. And I think in particular, young readers' literature can help us distill and make sense of the modern moment, because it is helping make sense of and distill that modern moment for young readers. And I think in many ways, this book really succeeds in drawing those parallels and having a historical setting that is so ripe for dramatic action, and also have a lot of parallels that speak to the modern moment while not feeling so overt that they border on preachy. And I think in many ways, this novel succeeds in not feeling preachy and exploring the nuance of a historical moment that could be easy to feel matter of fact with the benefit of hindsight. But also with the benefit of hindsight, we recognize the nuance and that history is full of everyday people forced to make everyday choices amidst said history. So I'm sure I could continue to talk about the minutia of Elspeth's story, but if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you, as always, for hanging out and listening to mine. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.